Every November, without warning, a lake in the far south of Australia changes colour. Not gradually, almost overnight. One week the water sits flat and grey, like poured concrete. The next, it has become an impossible saturated blue. The kind of blue that looks digitally altered, even when you're standing on the rim looking straight down into it. Tourists photograph it. Scientists have monitored it for more than a century, and for most of that century, nobody could fully explain why it happens, or why it fades back to grey again every autumn. But the colour was never the strangest part. This lake sits inside the mouth of a volcano, one of four, carved into the same crater field, in a country most people assume has had no active volcanoes since long before humans ever set foot on it. That assumption was wrong. And in recent years, geologists studying the rock, water, and oldest surviving stories of this place made a discovery that did something rare in science. It proved that a story, carried by word of mouth for longer than the pyramids have stood, was not a myth at all. It was an eyewitness report. This is Mount Gambier, South Australia, and what researchers found buried in its ash, its water, and its ancient traditions has forced volcanologists, archaeologists, and historians to reconsider exactly how long human memory can last, and what it has cost the people who got too close to find out. If you're new here, welcome. This channel covers the places on Earth where geology and ancient human history collide the strange formations, the old warnings, and the scientific investigations that finally explain them. We cover it with the seriousness and the respect these stories and these cultures deserve. No cheap theatrics, just the evidence. If that sounds like your kind of channel, subscribe now, because what happened at Mount Gambier only gets stranger from here. To understand what makes this landscape so unusual, you first need to understand what it actually is. Mount Gambier sits at the southern edge of the newer Volcanics province, a volcanic field sprawling across the border country of South Australia and Victoria, more than 400 separate eruption points scattered across roughly 15,000 square kilometres of farmland and pine plantation. It is, geologically speaking, the youngest volcanic field on the entire Australian continent, and Mount Gambier itself, along with its smaller neighbour Mount Shank, represents the very last gasp of that activity eruptions dated to somewhere between 4,300 and 5,000 years ago. In human terms, that is recent. In geological terms, it is essentially yesterday. These are not the cone-shaped, lava-spewing volcanoes of popular imagination. They are maars, a rarer, and in some ways more violent kind of volcanic feature. A maar forms when rising magma meets shallow groundwater trapped in porous rock. The result isn't a slow lava flow, but a single, catastrophic steam explosion, powerful enough to hurl multi-ton blocks of rock. Geologists call them volcanic bombs hundreds of metres from the point of eruption. Some of those bombs are still visible today, embedded in road cuttings on the edge of town. What's left behind once the debris settles is a wide, roughly circular crater with near vertical walls, which fills slowly with rainwater and groundwater to form a crater lake. At Mount Gambier, this happened 4 times in succession, leaving 4 maar craters clustered on the edge of the city: Blue Lake, Valley Lake, Leg of Mutton Lake, and Brown Lake. 2 have since dried out. 2 remain, and the larger of them, Blue Lake, is extraordinary by any measure. Over 1 kilometre across, more than 70 metres deep, its limestone walls dropping almost straight down from the picnic lawns at its rim into water that, for 8 months of the year, is a flat, unremarkable grey. 14 kilometres south, Mount Shank rises abruptly from the coastal plain, a near-perfect cinder cone barely 100 metres high, its own crater dry, because unlike Blue Lake, its floor never quite reached the water table below. Together, Mount Gambier and Mount Shank anchor what is now recognised internationally as the Kannawinka Global Geopark, the first UNESCO listed geopark in Australia. encompassing more than 50 sites across 2 states that preserve the clearest record of continental volcanism anywhere on the continent. But it's what lies beneath all of this that matters most to this story. The entire district sits atop a limestone aquifer, in places 150 metres thick, riddled with sinkholes, caves and flooded voids carved out over tens of thousands of years by slowly dissolving rock. It is, quite literally, a landscape built on hidden water that shaped these craters, fills them today, and, as we'll see, has claimed far more than the ancient volcano itself ever did. And then there's Blue Lake's colour. For reasons that took scientists more than a century to properly pin down, for 8 months it sits grey and unremarkable, and then, every year, without fail, it isn't grey anymore. Long before Lieutenant James Grant sailed past this coastline in December 1800 and named the mountain after a British admiral who never once set foot here. This land had another name and a far older history than anyone in Europe could have imagined. The Boandik people, traditional custodians of this stretch of South Australia's southeast, call the mountain Berrin. Its summit was known as Ering-Balam, home of the eagle hawk. And among the stories carried by the Boandik across countless generations is one that modern science did not take seriously for a very long time, the story of Craitbul. Craitbul, in Boandik tradition, was a giant ancestral being travelling with his family across this landscape in search of somewhere safe to live. Wherever they stopped, they dug earth ovens into the ground to cook their food, and at their first camp, on Mount Muirhead, the ground itself was hot enough to do it. Then, in the night, they heard it. The bullen. A bird, or a spirit the accounts vary, whose cry was said to signal the approach of a malevolent being named Tenetiona. Terrified, the family fled to Mount Shank. For a time, they were safe. Then the bullen shrieked again. They fled once more, this time to Mount Gambier. Here, finally, the bullen fell silent, but a new danger replaced it. The earth ovens themselves began to fill, water rising from somewhere below, flooding the ground where they had tried to cook and live. Craitbul's family abandoned the site a third and final time. What they left behind 4 flooded ovens, sunk into the earth, are the 4 craters that still sit on the edge of Mount Gambier today: Warwar, Ketlamalpi, Yatonlu, and Croatwari. We know them now as Blue Lake, Valley Lake, Leg of Mutton Lake, and Brown Lake. Read as pure narrative, it's a striking story. Read as a geologist, it is something else entirely. Ground hot enough to cook in. A warning sound before disaster. A forced evacuation. And finally, craters filling with water from below exactly as a maar does after it erupts, and the surrounding water table reclaims the empty basin. Every structural beat of the Craitbul story matches, almost exactly, the physical sequence of a real fretomagmatic eruption, described by people with no science of volcanism, no seismographs. No written language, only their own eyes, and the discipline to pass on precisely what they witnessed. And they witnessed it recently, geologically speaking. Mount Shank's eruption has been dated to roughly 5,000 years ago. Mount Gambier's last outburst roughly 4,300 years past. Which means the Craitbul story, if it does encode a genuine eyewitness account, has been carried forward by word of mouth for somewhere in the order of 200 human generations. This isn't an isolated case, either. Similar convergences have now been documented at other volcanic sites across the continent, among them the Gugu people of far north Queensland, whose traditions recall rivers catching fire, matching lava flows now dated to roughly 7,000 years ago. Across Australia, geographers studying this pattern are increasingly treating what was once dismissed as folklore as some of the oldest continuous historical records on Earth. The Boandik people did not need laboratories to know this ground was dangerous. They already knew. The only thing modern science has done, more than 4,000 years later, is catch up. The written record of this place begins not long after European settlement, and almost immediately it records this landscape's power to draw people to the very edge of disaster. Between 1853 and 1867, the poet and horseman Adam Lindsay Gordon lived in the district, working as a mounted policeman. Gordon had a reputation for reckless, extraordinary feats on horseback, and one story about him at Blue Lake has survived in the town's own memorials. On a bet, Gordon reportedly rode his horse directly at the old post and rail fence that then ringed the crater's edge and cleared it. Beyond that fence lay a ledge barely a metre wide, and beyond that a sheer drop of some 60 metres straight down into the water. Gordon landed the jump. Then, somehow, he turned the horse and cleared the fence a second time, back to solid ground. An obelisk on McDonnell Bay Road, raised in 1887, still marks the spot either one of the most astonishing feats of horsemanship in colonial Australian history, or a vivid early warning of exactly how close this landscape's edges can bring a person to death, with no supernatural explanation required. The lake's true toll, however, would come from below. By the mid-20th century, the flooded limestone caves and sinkholes threaded beneath this volcanic district had become a magnet for a new kind of visitor, scuba divers, drawn by some of the clearest fresh water on the planet. On 6 April 1969, two 18-year-old divers entered Kilsby's sinkhole, hoping to beat a previous 50-metre dive. Their equipment, by modern standards, was almost primitive no-contents gauges, no backup air, no watches. They ran a guide rope from 27 metres toward their goal. Neither surfaced. A search diver later found both bodies at 40 metres, gear in disarray, air still remaining in their tanks. They had not run out of air. Something, in the dark, had cost them their way back. They were the first divers to die in the Mount Gambier region's flooded caves. They would not be the last. The worst single incident came on 28 May 1973 at a sinkhole known as the Shaft, a site so popular that an estimated 8,000 dives had already been logged there without serious incident. 8 divers entered the water that day. Most stayed within an informally agreed boundary, a pile of collapsed rock roughly 60 metres down, marking the edge of what was considered survivable recreational diving. 4 of them did not stop there. Siblings Stephen and Christine Millett, along with Gordon Roberts and John Bockerman, continued past the rock pile into a narrow, silt-covered passage sloping down into total darkness, without laying a continuous guideline behind them. They were experienced ocean divers. They had never trained for this. At depths of around 65 metres, in total blackness, likely impaired by nitrogen narcosis, the 4 became separated from the entrance and from each other. All 4 drowned. Their bodies were recovered gradually over the following year. The tragedy directly led to the founding of the Cave Divers Association of Australia later that same year, and the creation of a dedicated police underwater recovery squad, a regulatory legacy that still governs cave diving access across the country today. Between 1969 and 1983 alone, similar tragedies at Kilsby's, Piccaninny Ponds, and other sites in the district brought the regional death toll into double figures 11 divers or more. Then, for almost a quarter of a century, the caves fell silent. In 2010, they claimed another life. This time the diver was no novice. He had roughly 2 decades of cave diving experience. It made no difference. Whatever waits in that darkness does not appear to discriminate between the careless and the expert. If you're waiting for the supernatural explanation, the curse, the vortex, the thing in the dark pulling divers off course, keep watching. Because what researchers actually found is stranger and far more unsettling than any of that. But first, if this kind of investigation is your thing, make sure you're subscribed, because we're about to walk through exactly how scientists cracked this case, layer by layer, calcite crystal by calcite crystal. For as long as the Blue Lake has drawn visitors, it has also drawn theories, some sillier than others. 19th century locals half joked that laundry dye used to whiten linen had somehow leached into the water and stained the whole lake blue, and accused each other of dumping it in to boost tourism. Others proposed a bloom of microscopic blue organisms rising to the surface each summer. In the internet era, the theories escalated. Mineral runoff from a cover-up, unexplained chemical dumping even, in the more fringe corners of the web. The suggestion that something about the site simply wasn't natural at all, the kind of loose, ominous framing that tends to attach itself to anything that changes this dramatically, this fast, without an obvious cause. The actual answer took over a century of patient observation to nail down, and it belongs entirely to chemistry. Researchers studying the lake sampled its water monthly across a full year, tracking the concentration of dissolved calcium carbonate through every season. What they found was a clean, direct correlation. Calcite concentration peaks in winter, exactly when the lake looks grey, and drops to its lowest point in summer, exactly when the lake turns vivid blue. The mechanism is elegant. As the surface layer warms toward 20 degrees Celsius each spring, dissolved carbon dioxide escapes into the air, the water's pH rises, and calcium carbonate that had been dissolved in the lake begins to precipitate out as microscopic crystals suspended through the upper water column. Those crystals scatter light at the blue end of the spectrum, the same basic physics that colours a clear sky or a glacial lake. Every winter, as the lake cools and turns over, those crystals redistribute through the depths and settle, and the water returns to grey. No dye, no algae bloom, no cover-up, just one of the more beautiful chemical processes in the natural world, playing out on a yearly clock inside a volcano. The disappearances underground resisted easy answers for longer, and inspired darker theories, whispers, among some divers, of a pull in the water that shouldn't exist, sinkholes that seem to take people rather than simply endanger them. But every formal investigation, from the 1973 government inquiry commissioned in the immediate aftermath of the Shaft tragedy through to every coronial inquest since, arrived at the same conclusion. There was no unexplained force at work, only an unforgiving combination of total darkness, fine silt that turns to an opaque cloud at the slightest disturbance, narrow, unmapped passages. And nitrogen narcosis, a real, measurable state that impairs judgment at depth in a way disturbingly similar to intoxication. Investigators traced the final route taken by Bockerman and the Millot siblings almost metre by metre, using recovered gear and cylinder pressures. There was no guideline laid. There was no mystery force. There was only distance, darkness, and a way back that nobody could find in time. Strip away every rumour, and what remains is a landscape that never needed embellishment to be dangerous. Begin with what's visible. Blue Lake's crater walls fall away almost vertically from the picnic lawns, where tourists take their photographs the same drop Adam Lindsay Gordon gambled his life clearing. On horseback, more than 150 years ago. A single wrong step at the rim, and there is very little between a visitor and 70 metres of near-freezing water. Now go beneath the surface, into the terrain that has actually claimed lives. The limestone aquifer underlying this entire district, in places 150 metres thick, has been dissolving for tens of thousands of years, carving a hidden network of caves, tunnels and flooded chambers that in some places plunge past 100 metres, deeper than most recreational scuba training ever prepares a diver to safely operate. Past the reach of any surface light, this is a world of absolute disorienting blackness, where the accidental brush of a fin against centuries of settled silt can reduce visibility to nothing within seconds, a phenomenon divers call a silt out, and one that has ended more than one search for the way back. Add to that bone aching cold at depth, thermoclines that shift without warning, and nitrogen narcosis, a real physiologically documented impairment that grows more severe the deeper a diver goes, clouding judgment exactly when clear judgment matters most. None of this requires a curse. It only requires one missed guideline, one moment of disorientation, in a place with no natural light to reorient by and no surface to swim toward in a hurry. And above ground, the volcano itself has never been formally declared extinct. Geoscience Australia and the researchers behind the Kanawinka Geopark classify the newer volcanics province, the wider volcanic field that includes Mount Gambier and Mount Shank, as dormant, not dead, a low-frequency but still active field, capable in principle of erupting again, just as it has done more than 400 times before across its long history. No warning signs are being monitored today, but geologically speaking, the door was never actually closed. This is what makes the Craitbul story land so differently once you know the science. The Boandik ancestors who fled Mount Muirhead, then Mount Shank, then finally Mount Gambier itself, were not reacting to a myth or a superstition. They were responding, generation after generation, to a real, measurable, and genuinely hazardous piece of the earth, reading warning signs modern instruments have only recently learned to detect, and passing that knowledge forward with a precision any field scientist would recognise as rigorous observation. The danger was never supernatural. It was always exactly this: unstable ground, hidden water, and a landscape that rewards respect and punishes carelessness in equal indifferent measure. The ancestors knew it first. Everyone who has died here since has, in one form or another, simply confirmed what they already understood. What makes Mount Gambier remarkable isn't really the colour of its water, or even the number of lives it has quietly claimed. It's the fact that two entirely different systems of knowledge of Boandik's story passed down for perhaps 200 generations, and a modern science built on water chemistry, coronial inquests, and dated ash layers independently arrived at the same conclusion about the same patch of ground. One called it tenetiona, the other calls it phreatomagmatic volcanism and nitrogen narcosis. Neither was wrong. Maybe that's the real lesson sitting at the bottom of this crater, that the oldest stories a culture keeps are rarely just stories. Sometimes they're the original data, collected long before anyone had the instruments to prove it. We'd like to know what you think. Does this change how you look at old myths and dreaming stories? Let us know in the comments below, and if you want more investigations like this one, subscribe. There's a lot more of this planet we haven't gotten to yet.